The Ottoman Empire was somewhat late to the dreadnought game. Their own shipyards had proved incapable of building even a pre-dreadnought, and its navy had largely been humiliated by a single Greek armoured cruiser. And so the Ottoman government sought to address the issue by simply buying ships in from overseas. Initially, they looked for a discount. Brazil's finances were beginning to look a little bit wobbly, and of course the price of a built or partially built dreadnought would be less than building one from scratch. But this initial attempt came to nothing, although a few years later a renewed attempt to buy the Rio de Janeiro would go through. And so, in the interim, Vickers and Armstrong were both approached to design a new battleship for construction. Vickers being perhaps the more profligate of the British yards when it came to selling, or trying to sell, warship designs to anyone who happened to have coin. In the end, one of Vickers' ideas was chosen. The Armstrong design put the secondary battery into twin turrets, whereas Vickers went, amongst other things, for the more traditional casement mountings. Almost all the designs put forward were some variation on the then current King George V class of super dreadnoughts. Thus, the main battery consisted of 10 13.5-inch guns in 5 twin turrets, 2 superfiring forward, 2 superfiring aft, and 1 amidships. But a number of features were introduced that would, in British service, be seen in the subsequent Iron Duke class. For the main battery, this included raising the amidships turret to the same deck level as the forward non-superfiring turret, whereas on the King George V this was on the same level as the aft non-superfiring turret, one deck lower. Additionally, the 4-inch secondaries were replaced by 6-inch secondaries on a 1-for-1 basis for a total of 16 guns, whereas on the Iron Dukes this would be reduced to 12. 4 submerged torpedo tubes, 2 per side, would complete the weapons loadout, with some anti-aircraft guns added later in her career. All of this was squeezed onto a hull almost 40 foot shorter, but 2 foot wider than a King George V, which meant that she was somewhat more agile, but required slightly more shaft horsepower per ton to retain her 21-knot top speed, which was delivered by 26,500 shaft horsepower driving 4 screws. Armour, though, had to be reduced. The main belt was still 12-inch thick, but with slightly reduced coverage, and the main armour deck was 3 inches thick instead of 4 inches at maximum as found in the King George V design. One ship was initially ordered, Resadaye, although further ships of the class, or possibly to a slightly modified design, would be ordered later. They would never progress much beyond the assemblage of materials. Resadaye herself, though, was laid down in August 1911, launched 2 years and 2 days later, and was ready to commission in late spring 1914. However, as tensions escalated in Europe, and likely aware of Ottoman sympathies for the Central Powers, and later of the secret treaty the Ottomans had signed with Germany, the British decided first to delay the ship's delivery, and then to subsequently seize them. This was in and of itself not unusual. All the way back to the Age of Sail, Britain and other nations had taken over ships being built for foreign navies in their yards if the country happened to find itself at war, with the usual arrangement being, at least if the country in question wasn't also the one that had just been declared war on, that it was more of an enforced sale with an option to buy back later than outright taking the ship. However, since the Ottomans refused to acknowledge the seizure and instead demanded their ships, in the case of Resadaye, she was simply taken without any compensation. She would thus be commissioned on the 19th of August 1914 as HMS Erin, which is a slightly obscure form of the Gaelic term for island. Within a month, she was part of the 4th Battle Squadron of the Grand Fleet, along with the ex-Rio de Janeiro, ex-Sultan Osman I Evell, now HMS Agincourt. As with much of the Grand Fleet, her early war consisted mostly of gunnery drills and patrols, although by the time of the Battle of Jutland her similarity to the King George V class, and the loss of HMS Audacious, saw her move to the 1st Division of 2nd Battle Squadron alongside the 3 remaining King George V's, whilst Agincourt was sent to the 6th Division of 1st Battle Squadron, which was kind of the odds and ends division. Whilst this meant she was near the front of the Grand Fleet, it also meant that between failing light, smoke, and positioning, she actually did fairly little in the battle itself, firing a few 6-inch shells and, uniquely for a British warship involved in the fight, nothing from her main guns. That would be about the extent of her excitement. Other operations with the Grand Fleet didn't lead to any further combat, and after the war she was largely found in reserve, or serving as a gunnery training ship. With the Washington Naval Treaty coming into effect, the idea was that, as a one-off ship, but close enough to a number of the retained ships, she'd make for a decent training vessel, but in the end that role went to another ship, and she was instead sold for scrap in 1922.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.